judges in court, whom according to him were using their executive positions to further their own interests.
Jadi jangan sesekali ada mana-mana pihak yang cuba menyamakan saya dengan individu-individu lain dalam kluster mahkamah. Saya dengan suka hati, dengan suka rela, dengan tanpa berbelah bagi melepaskan jawatan saya yang berbentuk eksekutif ini, sedangkan mereka mencari dan menggunakan jawatan eksekutif untuk kepentingan diri sendiri.
Wan Saiful was charged with soliciting and accepting 6.9 million ringgit in bribes in relation to a Jana Wibawa project a day after his arrest by the MECC. He claimed trial to both charges. Meanwhile, Bersatu President Tan Sri Muhyiddin Yassin said Wan Saiful's resignation does not imply that he is guilty of the charges he has been slapped with. Instead, it shows the level of responsibility taken by Bersatu leaders.
A new law will be tabled in Parliament for better management of the country's finances, says Deputy Finance Minister Dato' Sri Ahmad Maslan. The proposed Fiscal Responsibility Act, FRA, could cap the statutory debt limit to 65% of the national gross domestic product for developmental expenditures.
Ahmad said the proposed act will be tabled before the end of the year. According to him, the legislation was needed as the country has an outstanding debt of around 1.5 trillion ringgit. Among the components of the act is that the government cannot incur debt for operating expenditure and that the allocation for this must come from government revenue. Another component would also ensure that service charges for outstanding debts do not exceed 15% of the national revenue. On Tuesday, Prime Minister Datuk Sri Anwar Ibrahim, who is also Finance Minister, had said the country's debts comprised 107.9 billion ringgit in government debt, 205.9 billion ringgit in commitments on loans, 414.2 billion ringgit for other liabilities, as well as 18.2 billion ringgit for 1MDB. Anwar is scheduled to retable Budget 2023 on Friday.
The government may impose a tax on vape products as a measure to increase national revenue. Deputy Finance Minister Stephen Sim Chee Kiong said the Health Ministry is looking into the legal framework for taxation and there may be an announcement in Budget 2023.
The previous government announced plans under Budget 2022 to expand tax collection to vape liquids containing nicotine by imposing excise taxes at RM1.20 per milliliter, but the enforcement was postponed. According to a recent study by the Japan Tobacco International, the government missed out on 866 million ringgit in tax collection last year due to the postponement. Meanwhile, Stephen also addressed the loss of tax revenue due to smuggling of tobacco and alcoholic products.
Yang ini adalah pengiraan berdasarkan rampasan, ialah pada tahun 2021 353 juta ringgit dan 364 juta ringgit pada tahun 2022. Namun mengikut perkiraan industri dan melalui laporan-laporan yang telah dikemukakan, kerugian hasil kepada kerajaan sudah tentu lebih besar lagi dan berkemungkinan mencecah sehingga 5 bilion ringgit setahun.
He said the government would increase efforts to stop illicit cigarette and liquor smuggling with measures such as limiting cigarette transshipment activities to only certain ports, allowing only ISO standard containers for transport, and banning the use of small or barter trade boats.
Budget 2023 is unlikely to introduce major tax policy reforms in view of the need to manage inflation. Havina Singh from the Chartered Tax Institute of Malaysia says the government will also likely maintain the 2% income tax cut for the M40 group proposed in the previous budget.
In the previous announcement, there was this proposal that for a certain band rate, for the M40 group, there would be a reduction of the tax rate by about 2%. So I think something along those lines, a tweak of that perhaps will be applicable. And for companies as well, there was this announcement of a reduction of the SME tax rate for the first 100,000 by about 2%. So if there's going to be anything, it's probably something along those lines, because at the end of the day, the idea is to help with the rising cost of living for taxpayers in the country. With the announcement also that there will be no GST for the time being, I believe. The keyword would be time being. It's obviously, again, to try and manage the rising cost of living.
With a need to widen revenue sources, Harvinder discusses other measures Putrajaya can take to beef up its finances.
So I don't think there's going to be a major introduction of any kind of new taxes. The government would obviously need to look at how to increase tax collection. And I think some of these measures have been implemented. The TIN that was announced in the previous budget announcement, the tax identification number, to ensure that most taxpayers would be having a tax identification number, so that transactions that are entered into by the taxpayers, the idea is to basically increase the database of taxpayers. E-invoicing was also something that has been talked about, and the tax authorities have been putting in measures and processes and steps that they need to focus on tax audits, investigations, to ensure that taxpayers are all taxpayers are fairly doing their part in the payment of taxes. Those are probably the measures that will be looked at currently. And from there, the funds, that we have, if they're allocated appropriately, correctly, and utilized in the correct manner, is essentially talking about the effort to pump prime the economy. I believe it will bring about good economic recovery, sustenance initially, and recovery and growth eventually.
Public transport users, especially those in the Klang Valley, often face disruptions in their daily commute. For Budget 2023, urban mobility researcher Azif Azuddin outlines what the government must prioritize within this sector.
There are two major things that need to be addressed. One is service reliability, and the second is first mile, last mile infrastructure. Right? So when we talk about service reliability, we're talking about how we recently, or perhaps for the past few years, in fact, bus and rail services are seen as unreliable, right? We're talking about multiple rail delays and breakdowns over the past few months. We're talking about bus services that are missing, late, or perhaps only operate 30 minutes to hourly frequencies. So service unreliability is one of the major reasons why the public really doesn't trust using public transit, right? So then, but also we're talking about the second issue that we should be addressing in public transport, which is first mile, last mile infrastructure, right? I mean, you have to think about it in terms of how getting to your closest bus stop or train station is a very, very difficult task, right? And this is really due to how Malaysian roads are designed for cars and large vehicles, right? So little attention is given to how pedestrian infrastructure is developed, especially in making them safe and making them accessible.
According to Azif, the Transport Ministry's allocations for 2023 should be channeled towards improving service accessibility and reliability.
I'm thinking that one of the ways that we can improve public transit is really expanding the bus network and services across different townships in the country, right? So the previous Perikatan government allocated 180 million to improve bus services in Malacca, in Sabah, and Sarawak, right? And this is great, right, as a starting point. But I think ideally, if you want to make public transit accessible, you want it to be also expanded in different townships where bus services, whether privately run or publicly owned, could be further improved. And then secondly, this comes to the point of expenditure funding, right? Operation expenditure, or OPEX. Now, in order to improve services, in order to improve frequency, so there are more faster services, more frequent services, a lot for both rail and bus service, right? It means you need to fund the operations, right, in order for them to operate at a very satisfactory standard. Now, this means giving funds to allow for regular maintenance, repair, replacements, but also to allow the service to run as frequently as possible, because every time you run the service, it costs money, right? Now, previous governments, they've focused a lot on funding capital expenditure, or i.e. the development of major rail projects. So we see ECRL, we see MRT3, for example. Now, in focusing on investing in capital expenditure, they've sidestepped the importance of funding service operations, right? So focusing on OPEX, increasing allocations for OPEX is what allows services to run, is what makes it reliable to use for people, right?
Should Malaysia reduce the allocation for defence in Budget 2023, given federal government's declining revenue and other ministries' pressing fiscal needs? Tonight on Consider This, we ask the guests what happens when defence spending is cut. We will go for a quick break. Don't go anywhere.
Kami raihkan mereka yang tak gentar melawan arus. Mereka yang dah biasa menjadi luar biasa. Ubah suai pelan kami mengikut gaya hidup anda. Ikutlah gerak hati. Hiduplah dengan sepenuhnya. Inilah plan Celcom Xpax Mix and Match kami. Mix and Match hanya daripada RM20 sebulan dengan internet tanpa had.
Welcome back. The Philippines and Australia are exploring the possibility of conducting joint maritime patrols in the South China Sea. The discussion comes on the heels of similar talks held between Manila and Washington to counter China's growing assertiveness in pressing its territorial claims in the disputed waters.
Australian Deputy Prime Minister and Defence Minister Richard Marles said he had discussed the joint patrols with his Filipino counterpart, Defence Secretary Carlito Galvez Jr., during his visit to Manila. Philippines is ramping up its attempts to counter what is described as China's aggressive activities in the South China Sea, which has also become a flashpoint for Chinese and US tensions around naval operation. Last week, the Philippine government lodged a diplomatic protest after a Chinese Coast Guard used a military-grade laser to try to block one of its ships in the South China Sea. China has refuted the Philippine account of the incident, which it said did not reflect the truth.
South Korea's fertility rate, already the world's lowest, has dropped yet again. The National Statistics Body reported that the fertility rate, or the average number of children expected per woman, fell to a record low of 0.78 in 2022, down from 0.81 the previous year, dealing a blow to the government's efforts to encourage couples to have more children.
South Korea is the only country in the world with a fertility rate below 1. Experts say the rate needs to be at least 2.1 to keep the country's population stable at 52 million. New data showed the number of babies born last year also reached a record low. 249,000 babies were born in 2022, a fall of 4.4% from the previous year and the third year in a row that deaths have exceeded births in South Korea. More young people are choosing to delay starting families or giving up on having children altogether, citing the high cost of raising children, poor job prospects amid an economic slowdown and rising real estate prices. While some women say they prefer to prioritize their personal freedom and have ruled out finding a marriage partner. As a result, the number of marriages in South Korea reached an all-time low of 193,000 in 2021. With the world's lowest fertility rate and a rapidly aging population, concern is growing about the strain on its economy and the pension system, which may become depleted in the coming decades.
That is all we have for you on AWANI tonight. I'm Fana Shea. Thank you for watching.